So welcome back, and now we're going to look on page 380 of the textbook, and we're going to focus on the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteers and the slide towards militarism in Ireland at this point, and how this showed both the skill on Carson's point as a leader, but also the skill on Redmond's part as a leader as well. Because remember, sometimes you get a question asking you to compare the leadership of Carson and Redmond. So the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, is set up to protect Unionist interests militarily. So it's another point of pressure that's been put on Asquith, because if you have 100,000 men, which is an awful lot of people, drilling openly, you're putting pressure on the government, because that's 100,000 people in Ulster that are marching, that are training, that are a lot of them have mock arms as they're going on these marches, and then eventually after they get weapons in at Larne and Bangor, they will have actual arms. And what happens then is you're putting an extra kind of pressure on the government, because you're saying these are 100,000 men who are willing, because they signed that solemn league and covenant, don't forget, to take up these arms. They're drilling openly, they're getting ready for whenever Home Rule tries to come in. And the other thing is, they wanted to be seen that it's not a secret society. The IRB was a secret society. It was a group that had to keep in the shadows because the British government tried to suppress them and were putting people in jail. Think about how Michael Davitt was put in jail for his involvement in the IRB. So that's what would happen to leaders of the IRB and to members of the IRB. Not to the UVF. UVF members got to walk around the place because, like I said, similar enough to the Solemn League and Covenant signatories, there were members of the RIC that were in the UVF because this was seen as something that they felt morally obliged to do. So they get their weapons at Larne and Bangor, and this operation had no police or army interference. Now, was this because it was a marvellous exercise in misintelligence and direction for the police? That's what the UVF are using their espionage tactics to be able to divert their attention. No, it wasn't. It's just that the police and the army decided not to get involved because they supported this movement. So let's look at where Carson is at this point. He has a political aspect, which is the Ulster Unionist Party, who are agitating in Parliament to, stop the passage of Home Rule for the third time in 1914. So he's putting pressure on Asquith politically. They also have the social aspect. With this, you can really see it in the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant, that you have 500,000 people. But as well as this, he's going around Britain, raising the temperature in Britain about what's going to happen in Ireland. He's getting people agitated over there about the prospect of Ireland ruling itself, and those Protestants in Ireland going to be ruled by the Catholics. And remember, what was the attitude towards Catholics, and especially the Irish at this point? Remember what Horace Plunkett said, the guy who tried to who brought in fairly successfully the cooperative movement. He didn't think the Irish people could rule themselves. And this is similar in the attitude that a lot of British people would have. So socially, he's putting pressure on Herbert Asquith. And lastly, we have militarily, he's putting pressure on Herbert Asquith by having these 100,000 men drill openly and get weapons. This shows excellent leadership of unionism. We see the rise of unionism throughout this part of the course, but especially from mid-1880s right the way up to now. There was a little bit of a lull because it wasn't necessarily needed in the early 1900s, but now that it's needed, they needed a leader themselves. And Carson is that leader, and he's able to marshal his troops in these three different directions that hits three different sections of society, but all puts pressure on Herbert Asquith to not grant Home Rule to Ireland, or at least to all of Ireland, in 1914. So what about in Ireland? What about Redmond? What's Redmond doing at this point? Well, to talk about Redmond, we first need to talk about Owen McNeill. Owen McNeill sets up the Irish Volunteers in opposition to the Ulster Volunteers. He looks at how successful the Ulster Volunteers have been in galvanising the actions against the implementation of Home Rule. He praises the UVS structure and the motivation, the fact that they're done on a military structure with kind of a hierarchy. Now, he looks at this, but he says their motivation is a little bit different than the Home Ruler's motivation. And if you know something is probably going to come in down the line in 2 years, you can galvanise your support against that thing. The Irish Volunteers are in a slightly different position. What they actually want to happen, they think is bound to happen in 2 years. So they kind of feel that their fight has already been fought, that they've already won the battle. And it's only when they start to see the Home Rulers think that the fight has already been won. It's only when they start to see the opposition that Craig is able to, that Carson and Craig are able to muster, that they start to organise themselves a lot better. So he actually, like Owen McNeill, actually models his organisation on the Ulster Volunteer Force, which is, you know, a fair amount of praise being shown to the Ulster Volunteer Force. Because if your enemy is copying you, it must mean that you're doing something right. They arm in Howth. The guns come in, I hope, but they are opposed by the army and the police. Quite violently opposed, and there's deaths as they try to bring the guns into the country. You know, these are German guns, and as we know, in, you know, the September of 1914, that's when it all kind of kicks off in Europe. When the Germans get involved and the British get involved. So kind of using Britain's, I don't want to say enemy at this point, because everybody in Europe, all the major parties are against each other, but still going against one of Britain's enemies to get those weapons in. Now, Redmond sees the Irish Volunteers as a threat to the passing of Home Rule. He looks at this and says, if we have a violent militant organisation in Ireland, we are showing the British exactly what they think they're going to see when they see Ireland. We should be portraying to them a peaceful, democratic country that only wants to rule itself in a peaceful, democratic way. By having the Irish Volunteers drilling openly like the Ulster Volunteers, where bringing in weapons like the Ulster Volunteer Force, where, well, then that makes us look bad. It makes us look undemocratic, unparliamentary, that we can't run ourselves when we're being like violent before we're even getting power. So he has to do something about this. He has to try to gain control over the Irish Volunteers, because without control over the Irish Volunteers, there's a sense that Home Rule may slip away, because there is that waiting period. Because Herbert Asquith could turn around and say, well, what about those Irish Volunteers? Unless you have control of them, how could I possibly give you Home Rule? So what he does is he demanded 25 Home Rule party members be put on the board of the Irish Volunteers. This will give him a very large say in how the Irish Volunteers were to be run and in the democratic decisions that the Irish Volunteers would take. Now, Owen McNeill, he succumbs to this and says, okay, fair enough, because he understands as well, he's a practical person. He understands that, yes, you need the Irish Volunteers, almost like a deterrent to the Ulster Volunteer Force, but that it could be seen as a kind of a negative for Ireland, especially when you're trying to bring in Home Rule. But that doesn't mean that Owen McNeill isn't 100% behind the idea of militarism if militarism is needed. He understands the realities of a situation. If you go to page 381, you will see a quote from Owen McNeill. And he says, "What we call our country is not a poetical abstraction." I love that phrase, because it means that Ireland isn't just this romantic idea of what Ireland is. It's a practical thing that is tangible, that's right in front of us. So we can't be talking about Kathleen Ní Houlihan as Yeats had in his play, or Roisin Dove, or the Shamban Bucht. These are all names for this poor Irish woman, kind of elderly person who's old and decrepit, who becomes strong and beautiful when people sacrifice themselves for Ireland. These people aren't real, who is calling on us to save her. That's not the reality. The reality is we have a chance to rule ourselves, a country that is tangible and real. What do we do to do that? We're not talking about poetry, we're not talking about the Anglo-Irish Literary Revival or the Gaelic League or anything like that. We're talking about politics. How do we protect this idea of Home Rule? The only way to do that is through the volunteers, and obviously through the Home Rule party as well. Now, this leads us back to Redmond. This is effective leadership on his part because he understands the situation that Asquith would be in. He needs control of the Irish Volunteers, but also needs them there if necessary. So now he has a handle on the Home Rule Party in Parliament, but he also has a handle on the militaristic side of it as well by gaining a fair amount of control over the Irish Volunteers. One of the reasons why Ireland seems to be heading towards not just home rule, but also towards civil war at this point is the effective leadership on both accounts of Carson and Redmond. And that's what we're going to talk about into the very last lesson. And we're going to talk about the run-up to 1914 and how World War One seems to avert the crisis that seemed to be about to occur in Ireland. I'll see you for that one.